Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome back to my 5 novels about series. And today I wanted to talk to you about 5 novels that are about novels. I feel like it would have made more sense and sounded better if I called this video Books About Books, but then it wouldn't have fitted in neatly with my 5 novels about series. So we're going to call it Novels About Novels. So there are 5 books I want to tell you about today, all of which I love a lot, and all of which are filled with a love of books and lots of fun things in connection with books. So the first 2 are favourites from my childhood, and the first one is Inkheart by Cornelia Funk. It is the first in a trilogy of books about a young girl who has the power to read characters out of books and to read herself and other people into books. So she has magic abilities to make fictional worlds and real life interact. Now, I cannot tell you that much about the Inkheart trilogy. It has been a very long time since I read Inkheart. It's been at least 15 years, probably 16 or 17 years. And I do not remember the book that well. But what I can tell you is that Inkheart was my favourite book of all time until I read Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. That was the book that Our Mutual Friend knocked off the top spot. That was my favourite book for years and years and years of my childhood, and I loved it completely. I really should reread it because I'm very curious to know what it was like. But even though I don't remember Inkheart that well, I thought I would mention it here in a video about books because one of my favourite things about Inkheart as a child, which I do remember, was how fully infused it was with the love of books and storytelling and literature, and I loved how Inkheart was just full of that love of books. So yeah, even though I don't remember it that well, I do remember how I felt about it, and I do remember some of the things I loved about it, and I definitely need to reread it sometime soon. A second childhood favourite of mine, which is all about books, is Matilda by Roald Dahl. Now this I can tell you more about because I did reread it last year and I absolutely loved it again, as I had when I was a child. Matilda tells the story of a little girl who loves to read and loves books, and her family do not love to read, they do not love books, they only like to watch the television, and they think that there is something wrong with Matilda for liking books. They're very, very unkind to her. But Matilda finds solace in the library and later in school, and in learning and in books she finds ways to be herself and to be happy, and it's just absolutely beautiful. I love so many things about Matilda as a book. But one of my absolute favourite things about it is how much respect for books and learning, and what a love of books and learning runs throughout the whole of the book. It's so lovely and I thoroughly enjoy it and I highly recommend it. If you haven't ever read Matilda by Roald Dahl, you should, especially if you're a book lover. It is a real treat. The next one I want to mention is one of my absolute favourite books of all time. In fact, it is my favourite modern novel. It's my favourite novel not written in the 19th century, and that is The 13th Tale by Diane Setterfield. I have read this book 3 times, I think, possibly 4. The first time I read it was when I was about 14, I think, and I just absolutely fell in love with this book. This book tells the story of a woman called Margaret who was grown up in an antiquarian bookshop that her father runs, surrounded by old books, and all her life she has only read old books. She loves Victorian literature, but she hasn't really read anything from the 20th century. And then one day she is approached by the most famous author of the present day, which we're assuming is kind of late 20th century, who says she wants Margaret to write her biography. Vida Winter, this incredibly famous author, wants to tell the story of her life, which no one quite knows, and she only wants to tell it to Margaret. So Margaret goes up to the middle of nowhere in Yorkshire to meet this famous author who begins to tell her the story of her life, except that she isn't exactly always telling the truth. It is an amazing book in so many ways. It's full of all of the things I love, like a looking back narrative and a lot of really interesting things about memory, complicated, messed up family dynamics, unreliable narration, dual narratives, flitting back and forward through time, so many things that I love and that ticks all the boxes for me. But the other thing that I love about The 13th Tale is that it is absolutely filled with a love of books and a love of writing and a love of literature and what they can do for you, and also how they can comfort you and how they can be a support and how they can have significance. There are so many literary references and so many bits about the love of books that I just absolutely love. I feel like no one writes about the love of books quite like Diane Setterfield. Let me read you a little bit about the bookshop that Margaret's father owns, because I just love this and it makes me really happy. The shop itself makes next to no money. It is a place to write and receive letters, a place to while away the hours waiting for the next international book fair. In the opinion of our bank manager, it is an indulgence, one that my father's success entitles him to. Yet in reality, my father's reality and mine, I don't pretend reality is the same for everyone, the shop is the very heart of the affair. It is a repository for books, a place of safety for all the volumes once so lovingly written that at present no one seems to want. And it is a place to read. A is for Austen, B is for Bronte, C is for Charles, and D is for Dickens. I learnt my alphabet in this shop. My father walking among the shelves, me in his arms, explaining alphabetisation at the same time as he taught me to spell. I learned to write there too, copying out names and titles onto index cards that are still there in our filing box 30 years later. The shop was both my home and my job. It was a better school for me than school ever was, and afterwards it was my own private university. It was my life. It's so beautiful. I love this book so much. The last two are two slightly more recent reads, both of which I absolutely loved. And the first one is Mrs Gaston and Me by Nell Stevens. This is an amazing novel. I will say, I'm calling this a novel. That is what it has been marketed as in the UK. In the US, it's been marketed as a memoir, and I think it probably is something that blurs the lines between the two. But I consider it a novel, so I'm gonna count it as one for now. This is a truly amazing book which follows a young woman who is doing a PhD on Elizabeth Gaskell, and we're sort of following her learning more about Elizabeth Gaskell as a writer and as a woman, while she's also going through a very complicated long-distance relationship. And then there's also a dual narrative where we're exploring Elizabeth Gaskell's life and the kind of complications of that as well. I loved this book so much. It is full of a love of Elizabeth Gaskell that made me incredibly happy. I think partly because I love Elizabeth Gaskell so much, and there are other authors that I love, but the other authors that I love, thinking especially of Charles Dickens and Jane Austen, they get a lot more love than Elizabeth Gaskell does. And Elizabeth Gaskell doesn't get enough love, and this book is just infused. Every single page is full of a love of Elizabeth Gaskell and her work, and it just made me so happy because I just don't see that everywhere. And it reminded me how much I love Elizabeth Gaskell and how neglected she is as an author, and it was just beautiful, guys. It was just absolutely beautiful. This made me sob so much. I cried for a good 15 minutes and I wasn't even sure why. I think just because it was so lovely and beautiful. When did I first start to love her? Was it when I was a teenager and read Mary Barton for the first time? It could have been then, or when I moved on to North and South or Ruth or Cranford, turning pages restlessly, wanting to get to the end without wanting them to be over. Or was it when, as a master's student, I found her books on the reading list for a module called Bleakly, Death in the 19th Century? I began an essay about her weird little novella, Lois the Witch, in which a young English girl travels to Salem and gets accused of witchcraft. The story of Lois seemed an odd choice of subject matter for an author I'd previously associated with domestic sagas and philanthropically motivated condition of England novels, but I loved it and I loved her for writing it. When I imagine my ideal PhD, the one that could actually be a labour of love, a monomania, a joy to write, it is one long letter to Mrs Gaskell. It's just, I love it. I love this a lot. I will say you should have probably read the majority of Elizabeth Gaskell's work before you read this. There are quite a few Gaskell spoilers. Lastly, I want to talk about a very recent read, and that is Death and Mr Pickwick by Stephen Jarvis. This is a wonderful novel that I read earlier in April and just absolutely loved. So this is a fictionalised account of the creation of the Pickwick Papers, which was Charles Dickens's first novel. And basically this book follows the original illustrator of the Pickwick Papers, Robert Seymour, and creates a fictionalised account of the beginning of the Pickwick Papers as a novel, where rather than Dickens being the creator of the character of Mr Pickwick, it is in fact Robert Seymour, the artist, who creates the character, and then Dickens kind of takes over and things go on from there. This book is absolutely fascinating and really, really wonderfully done. There are a lot of things I love about this book. It is a fantastic historical novel set in the early 19th century, leaving aside all the Dickens references. It is a really fantastic piece of historical fiction. But I also love how this book is like a giant love letter to the Pickwick Papers and to all of the characters in it. I love how this book fantastically explores the complexities of the characters within the Pickwick Papers and also the effect they had on all of the readers. I love how this book looks at art and literature, at words and pictures and the differences between them and the different power they can have and which can have the most power. And I also love how this book sort of mirrors the Pickwick Papers in its structure. It's very episodical with little stories of different characters who aren't the main ones, like dotted here and there throughout, in a way like the Pickwick Papers does. And it's also got this kind of frame narrative of someone who is researching the origins of the Pickwick Papers as a book. So they're kind of sorting through accounts and different bits of literature to try and work out what happened, which is wonderful as well. There's just such a wonderful love of literature in here, both in the fact that it is a book about the Pickwick Papers and about the power of the Pickwick Papers and its characters in many ways, but also in the way that this book is a book which joyfully uses a lot of literary devices in a really clever and meta way, which I love, both kind of borrowing Victorian devices and other ones. It's just absolutely wonderful. It was such a joy to read and I would highly recommend it. You do need to have read the Pickwick Papers, I think, before you've read this to really appreciate it, but you don't have to have read any other Dickens novels. It is a wonderful book and I absolutely loved it, and definitely a book that is full of a love of books. So there we have it. Those are 5 novels about novels, 5 books about books. I hope you enjoyed this video. Do let me know down in the comments what your favourite books are that are about books. And that's it for now. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video. And philanthropic and philanthropic and philanthropotically.